I'm Adam Watson. I'm one of our agriculture agents here with UT Extension, Washington County. I cover everything horticulture, so I'm glad you're joining us this evening for pruning fruit trees. Um, Glad that you all could make it. It's a beautiful day today. In fact, this afternoon I was out pruning some apple trees in preparation for Saturday's class. If somebody signed up and decided to stay outside and do something in the garden, I'm not going to feel too badly about it. I understand the conflict. But today we are going to be talking about pruning fruit trees. And so we'll be looking at stone fruits as well as apples and pears. And so we'll just go ahead and get started. Keep in mind, if I use brand names or sources or companies or anything like that, understand it's not an endorsement by myself nor the university of whatever we're talking about. It's just an example to help with communication. So just keep in mind, no guarantees and no endorsements. Why do we worry about pruning fruit trees? Well, pruning is critical to good production. There's a few things it does for us. It reduces disease. It does that because when we do a good job with pruning, we have better airflow as well as sunlight penetration into those fruit trees. That reduces wetness, leaf wetness, fruit wetness, both of which makes it more difficult for diseases to have a good time of it, so to speak. It also encourages fruit production. What we do is we limit the vegetative growth, and so we're pushing that energy that could have been making the plant grow more vegetatively into the fruiting. And probably the number one mistake we have in backyard fruit is either not pruning or not pruning enough. Sometimes folks are hesitant or they're afraid they're going to remove too much. Quite frankly, I think generally we see under pruning rather than over pruning. There's probably always the exception, but don't be afraid to give it a try. And hopefully tonight we'll give you some tools to do it well. One big thing I'll mention, mummy fruits. So if you have any fruits left over in the orchard, in the berry yard, in the vineyard, go ahead and get rid of those and trash them. Don't just leave them on the ground. Today on the site for Saturday's hands-on pruning class, there were a few mummy fruit in the tree. The reason we want to get rid of those is they are a source of disease inoculum. So they have the spores or the bacteria present that will spread to the plant and new tissues this spring. So we want to make sure we get those out. So any type of fruit we have, make sure you're taking care of those mummies this time of year when we go into prune. I, of course, titled this pruning, but we can also talk a little bit about training, especially with young trees. Whenever we are dealing with those, it's not always that we grab cutters first thing. We can actually do a lot with training and some different methods to maybe prevent the need to even use our pruning tools on a tree. So we can train those trees so they have a better shape for us in architecture. It can promote early production, increase fruit quality, and quite frankly, make it easier for us to do things like spraying if we choose to do that. There's a lot of vocabulary we could spend a while on with pruning. I don't want to do that. A few that I probably will use today as we go along. Scaffolds are main branches. Water sprouts are adventitious shoots that grow straight up. Hangers, these are any branches that are either growing down or originating on the underside of a branch. And we'll also talk about branch angle or the crotch of a branch, and it's the angle between the branch and its point of attachment. These are important because some are weaker, some are stronger. And so there's a lot of other terms you can see there depicted in the illustration, and I'll try to limit those so that we understand each other well. I'll mention that as we go through this evening, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll definitely circle around at the end and answer those. One thing to do a good job with pruning that we have to be able to get a grasp of is identifying annual growth. And so most trees make it pretty easy for us. This was a picture I borrowed from University of Maine. This was actually a cherry tree. But what we want to look for is a group of stacked rings or ridges on a branch. That's a good indication of that was one season's worth of growth. And so to the left of this arrow is one year, to the right is another year. Depending on the exact tree and variety and fruit, sometimes there can be stark differences in the bark color and texture, sometimes less so. So this isn't necessarily dramatic as far as color goes, but there's a little bit of difference. But those stacked rings show us that's where new spring growth sprang from. And so understanding that gives us an idea of whether we're moving last year's growth or a few years' growth whenever we make pruning cuts. So it's important to recognize that. When we're talking about apples and pears, they mostly flower on short twigs called spurs. So one thing I don't want you to do is go into your orchard and prune off all these little tiny limbs that look like they weren't going to grow much or do anything, because those could very well be your fruiting spurs. So that's not what we want to do, so just be aware of that. And of course, there's always those exceptions. And so we actually have some trees that either are partially or fully tip bearing, and they actually bear rather on short spurs on flowers at the branch ends. To me, it kind of reminds me of blueberries, where blueberries fruit on the very end of branches. So there you see some varieties that do this, and just be aware of that. We want to be very careful about preserving those tips on these varieties. Otherwise, we are greatly reducing our fruit load. And here's just an example of that again in picture form with the tip bearing on the left. The very end tip of the branches has those sort of roundish buds that are our flowering buds, or we have a short spur there on the right. Buds look very similar, but they're on different sort of arrangements. Understanding we've got really two kinds of pruning cuts we can make is helpful, because there's times and places to use one or the other, but not the other. And so we'll talk about this. Heading cuts. What a heading cut does is it removes the tip of the branch. It removes the apical bud, the bud that's at the very end. That interrupts the flow of auxin. On trees, you have auxin being produced in those apical or tip buds, and that flow of the plant hormone flowing backwards along a gradient actually reduces the growth of other branches. If you tip these, if you remove that apical bud, you stop the flow of auxin. And that means all those buds that had been dormant or subordinated, slowed down by that hormone, are now able to grow more. So this is exactly what we do when we talk about herbs or flowers, things like that, where we pinch them to get more growth, to get them bushier. This is exactly what we're taking advantage of. In a fruit tree, when we want more growth, when we want to encourage new branching, we use heading back cuts. Great tool. There's times to use it. So we use it oftentimes with young trees that we're trying to get established, because we want to have branches to choose from. We want to have the options. We also do this on mature trees. If we have trees that need to be renewed, if they're no longer productive, we can actually go in, remove some portions of branches, remove those tips, and actually encourage new branching, new growth, and reinvigorate that tree. The other one in our toolbox is a thinning cut. So thinning cuts reduce the amount of canopy we have. It reduces the number of branches. What we do with a thinning cut is we will follow a branch back, whether large or small, to its point of origin. And then we remove it at that point of origin. So we're not leaving stubs normally. We're not doing anything but removing a branch entirely. And this can be a side branch, it can be a primary branch, whatever the case may be, as we need. But again, the point of this is to reduce what's present. We're thinning. We do this at times on both young and mature trees. And when you have a tree that is somewhat unkept and you're trying to get it back under control with pruning, you're going to do primarily thinning cuts because you've got too much tree there typically. So we probably use thinning cuts more in the home orchard unless you've been doing a very good job of staying on top of it. But those are our two big types of cuts, heading and thinning. We talk about branch angles, and that whenever we're selecting branches, we want wide angled limbs. And what we're talking about is how they connect to the main trunk typically, like when we're establishing scaffolds. But this can even be secondary or even further removed limbs. Let me grab my laser pointer for a second. So the reason we want this angle of attachment to be between 45 and 60 degrees is because of something called bark inclusion. So in the left example, we have the wood tissues continuing, we have that branch, and we have good connection. So across this entire branch face on that trunk, we have attachment, very strong. On the other side, we have just the opposite. We have a tighter branch angle in here. And what happens is we don't get the continuation of the wood tissues. So in this particular example, the only attachment between the trunk and that limb is actually on the bottom half. So that's the only portion that's attached. And obviously you get a snow load, you get an ice load, you get a heavy fruit load. This splits out because it's only half attached. In fact, during Hurricane Helene, when a neighbor's tree fell onto our office and punctured through the roof and the ceiling, it was exactly this scenario. It was included bark. It wasn't a strongly attached limb, and so it failed when we had that weather. So that included bark creates weak attachment, which is prone to failure. This is also exactly why calorie pears are an issue. They have extremely tight branching like this, and it causes failure. So there you will see some differences from different varieties. You will see some that are more prone or less prone to this, but we have to watch it. And so what we want to do, pears I think are bad about this, Bartlett's and others, because they want to grow strongly upright. And when those branches are upright, we are more likely to have included bark. So watch your angles. It is important. And there are some ways to deal with it. So another thing to mention, depending on your experience, we don't do any sort of coverings or paintings or wound coatings whenever we're pruning. Once upon a time, this was the standard practice. It was good tree husbandry, so to speak. We now know we create more problems than this solves. So we don't use any sort of wound paints at all. We just want to be careful how we make those cuts to help them heal faster. When we talk about pruning across the orchard, we don't prune every tree the same way. So our stone fruits, those would be peaches, plums, cherries, apricots, which probably will never fruit here, or other stone fruits, are open center or open vase. Apples and pears, we either look typically at a central leader or a multi-leader tree. And of course, there's always the odd exceptions. Maybe it's super dwarf trees that we're growing on trellises, sort of their own thing. Sometimes if we have very mature trees that we're inheriting, we just kind of have what we have. And so we have to deal with it. Espalier trees are another example, very unique pruning thing that's sort of its own thing. So there are exceptions, but generally stone fruits are open center and central leader or multi-leader for apples and pears. Talking about peaches, one of our stone fruits, how do we deal with stone fruits at planting? This is always probably the hardest pruning to get someone to do because essentially at planting, we're going to cut it back to just a stick in the ground. And I realize that you think, but I just bought this plant. It looks nice. It has healthy branches. Why on earth would I prune it back? It's because where it was grown in the nursery, it was not trained properly for good architecture for growing fruit. That wasn't the job of the nursery. They weren't supposed to do that. So what we do, we plant the tree. And again, this dormant season is when we're planting a lot of these trees. You know, bare root trees are a great option, lower cost. And when we're mail ordering, we can get any variety we want. And variety selection is very important for success. But essentially what you do, you remove all the branches below the height that you'd like the permanent scaffolds to begin. So typically with peaches, we're about 18 to 24 inches above the ground. If we have some branches that are at the right height already when we plant it, we can leave a little 1/4-inch stub. And I'll talk about this more in just a moment because a minute ago I was saying we don't leave stubs. This is a scenario that we do. And basically, we top the tree about 8 inches above that highest scaffold branch that may already exist. because what we're wanting to do is start that architecture out young. In the resources, there are some videos that show this fairly well in a little more detail. But I'll just mention tonight, you can see the small little stubs there on the stick, and that's on purpose, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But we do this because if you don't, the branches that are on there when you plant it are most likely not at good angles, not properly arranged to get the final result we want. And so you're always going to be fighting that. And because this was a plant that was dug up and moved, and I would say the same thing about container plants as well, because we have to generally cut those roots because generally they're overgrown in pots. You're disrupting that root system. So by removing some of that top, you're actually making its transition and its reestablishment easier. So it's a good thing to prune these back from that standpoint as well. But the reason we do this is to create an architecture that works for us later. And I realize this is probably one of the hardest things to get people to do. So I said, we don't leave stubs, except when we do. And so this is a scenario I just mentioned where we might leave a stub if there's a branch that's about where we want it already. Sometimes this is referred to as a Dutch cut, and it's purposely to stimulate the growth of a lateral branch from that stub. One good thing about when we do this, we actually are almost guaranteed a very good branch angle because how it originates from the underside. And so that gives us a very strong branch back in that point. So this can be where if we have a branch on a tree and maybe a deer chewed off the end or a buck rubbed its antlers on it and broke it, or your husband hit it with a lawnmower or whatever the case may be, this can be a way to rejuvenate that limb, to bring it back, to kind of make a repair, let it regrow from the stub that was already where you wanted it. So we do occasionally leave a stub, but not in general pruning. We're very specific about when we do it. So what about our apples and pears? Very similar. Again, we're topping that tree about 6 to 8 inches above the first scaffold branch we want in height. So about 30 to 32 inches. Generally speaking, you'll commonly see language referring to, you top them at your belt height, at waist height. Guess it depends on how tall you are. There are times when you may choose to go higher than that. If you're thinking about managing under the tree and mowers or things like that, you may choose to have your starting branches be higher. Nothing wrong with that. But in general, we're about 30 inches off the ground. So we have that whip left. And basically what we want to do is, what happens is you see there on the bottom. We're done with our pruning. It's growing along. Spring happens. Those buds start to grow. We then want to select one of the topmost buds that's in good shape. Looks like it has good attachment as our central leader, if we're going with a central leader tree. And because if we're going with a multi-leader tree, we can leave more than one. But with a central leader tree, we're already wanting to start, hey, there's one top growing point on this tree, and that's going to continue as the plant grows. So again, and I've seen this in ball and burlap trees. I've seen this in container trees. 99 times out of 100, they don't have the architecture we would want for a fruit tree coming from the nursery. So I encourage you to be ruthless with this and do it even if it's something that you feel like you shouldn't be doing. So one thing we can do sometimes to encourage limb development, especially if we have a tree, maybe we've got it started, but for whatever reason, and I've seen trees do this, they may not have a branch on a particular side, and we want a balanced tree. We want to capture as much sunlight all the way around. We can actually do some bud notching to encourage limb development. So we can find buds on most any branch that aren't actively growing. They're dormant. And what we can do is basically cut through the bark, cut out a little wedge above it. By doing that, it simulates tipping or doing a heading back cut because we've stopped the flow of oxygen. We basically cut into the piping of that plant above that bud, and it stops the flow of oxygen. And because of that, that bud says, oh, it's my turn to grow now. And it does. And so this can be a way to encourage a limb where you need it. Here's just another view of it, kind of a better shot of what we're removing when we cut that notch. It's not a dramatically deep notch, but it is deep enough to reach into those vascular tissues. It can also, at the same time, if we put a notch below a shoot, it can also weaken its growth or slow it because we basically have a pooling of auxin. So we have a higher concentration of auxin at that point, which will slow growth. So we can both speed up or slow growth down just by doing some notching on plants. Not something we do a lot, but it is something to know. It's something in our toolbox that we can do occasionally if we need to either encourage or slow down a branch. So we talked about, these newly planted trees. Whenever we have new growth, that's about mid-May, when it's 3 to 5 inches in length or so, we can do a lot of training at this point. And so I think this is very important for those newly planted trees. We can go out there with clothespins, and basically because it's very young, very supple growth, we can use those to direct its growth so it has a nice wide branch angle. We can also put toothpicks in there, so actually poke a toothpick into the limb, into the bark, poke it back into the stem or the trunk, and kind of use it as a wedge. You can do things like placing a weight on the end of the branch even. We don't keep these in here indefinitely. We keep them in there maybe 1 to 2 months. So probably by the end of July, I'd say you'd want to be removing them for sure. But what we've done is as those tissues begin to harden, because they come off supple and green to begin with, but they harden and become more woody, more rigid, but we've got them established in the shape we want, basically. And so we can do training, not cutting, to get good desired branches. And again, so this means after we're done with our dormant pruning, we come back in mid-May, start doing training of what regrows. This is also the same time when if we're doing like a central leader tree on an apple, we're selecting that central leader, that 1 leader to grow. So a couple of tasks to do. There's other ways to spread limbs out when they're not just a little bitty tree, when they're older. We can use physical spreaders. They make plastic ones you can buy. The old school method is just take about a 1x1 piece of wood, however long you need, drive a finish nail in either end, and then sharpen the head of the finish nail, grind it so it's sharp, and then you just poke it into the bark and wedge it basically and wedge those limbs apart. Again, this works for young limbs. Old woody limbs are not going to be moved. You're going to break them. Younger limbs we can do this with. And again, pears, I think, are a perfect tree that we really need to pay attention doing this. They're also a great example of where we can attach a weight. So tie a string to the end of the limb, tie it to a brick, to a bottle of water, something with enough weight to bring that limb physically down. And again, that helps open it up. So we can improve the architecture again without cutting. We do dormant pruning pretty much anytime February to bloom in our region. And in fact, for peaches, I would even go so far as to say we can wait until bloom happens if we want to, because with a lot of our peach varieties, it's always pins and needles whether or not they'll get past the spring frost. And so if you want to preserve every bloom possible, you can wait to prune until after bloom with peaches. I won't be angry with you for doing that. We do also have the ability to do some summer pruning, which really is thinning in June. Probably want to be done with it by July, but this can be a great tool for trees you're trying to manage and get back under control. You can go in, selectively remove, doing those thinning cuts again. And this is, when we look at trees in winter, when they don't have leaves, we may not see how overgrown they are, but certainly in summer when everything's fully leafed out, we get a better picture of, wow, maybe we need a little more thinning. And so this gives us an opportunity to do that. We typically want to start in the home orchard, pruning those which are most hardy to the ones that are the least hardy, because pruning can encourage growth. It can encourage bud break. And so we want to pick something that is furthest away from bud break to begin with. So again, earliest things like apples and pears, European plums, then something like the peaches, Asian plums, and cherries. And again, we can wait on peaches. In fact, I'd probably tell you, unless your schedule wouldn't allow you to prune during the bloom period, I would encourage you probably to wait because we do want to preserve every bloom possible. We don't need every bloom on a tree to have a crop off of any of these trees at all. Only a small percentage of blooms have to be successfully pollinated and grow to maturity. But when we have trees that are prone to spring frost damage, I would encourage you to delay those, and we can do that. And similarly, because of hardiness, younger trees are less hardy, so we prune those last. Oldest trees, they're pretty tough, and so we can prune them first in any given group. When it comes to pruning tools, really, you don't need heavy equipment. Hopefully, we're doing everything in a timely manner, and the majority of cuts we're going to be making are going to be just with hand pruners. A saw works well. There are any number of battery operated saws and even battery operated pruners now. You can use those if hand strength is limited. Certainly, they're a great option. Loppers that give you extra leverage if you have to remove something larger. Generally speaking, I do most pruning with hand pruners. Anything larger, just depending on the scenario, I'm either using a saw or loppers. I don't typically think we should be using a chainsaw to prune on our fruit trees. If we are at the point we need a chainsaw, we might want to rethink what we're doing with the tree because we always want to do pruning sooner rather than later. And so certainly there may be scenarios where we need something more, but what you see on your screen there should handle 99% of any pruning task in the home orchard. I do like to encourage wearing goggles if you're not already wearing glasses like me, because especially if you're dealing with overgrown trees or things like that, you're bobbing and weaving around branches trying to get the right angle and get the pruners or the loppers to fit in exactly where you need them so you can make the cut, and you're liable to poke yourself in the eye. So if you don't already wear glasses, I generally encourage people to consider goggles or a hat to try to prevent that from happening, because I have poked myself in the eye before when pruning trees. Making a good cut's important because basically when we do a good cut, the bud we leave behind is going to survive and grow. And that's a good thing because whenever we're making these cuts, we do want to pick the bud that is facing the direction we want it to grow. So for instance, in the green box, we see a correctly made pruning cut, about 1/4 of an inch above the bud we're leaving behind. And we have a little bit of a slant so water won't pool on it. That bud itself is going to grow, in theory, towards the right of the screen. Certainly, we wouldn't expect it to grow to the left. And so because of that, the bud below it is probably going to go the other direction. And so we want to try to preserve the bud that we want to grow. And so we want to make a good cut. Too close, we'll see that bud die. Too far away from the bud, it can still die. And so that's why getting it about right is worth a little bit of intentional action whenever we're beginning to prune, learning to prune. Certainly when you've got big trees and you're doing multiple trees, you can't baby every single cut you're making. Nobody expects that. But especially on younger trees where there's fewer buds, less plant, a little intentionality is a good thing for those trees. We do occasionally have some odd cuts we'll make. We don't do this a lot, but sometimes if we have a very vigorous upright branch, we may choose to cut above a side branch and have a new horizontal branch happen. Again, we don't do this a lot, but there are scenarios where we would do this, so I thought it was worth mentioning because it is kind of out of the norm. You'll sometimes see this referred to as a bench cut. So same basic practices apply about 1/4 inch or so above that branch that we're leaving, sloping so water drains off. When we're removing branches, when we're thinning, and this goes across horticulture, not just for our fruit trees, anytime we've got something that we're not just snipping off with hand pruners, I'm going to encourage you to do 3 steps. So if we're not just using hand pruners or loppers, if we're using a saw of any shape and size, I'm going to tell you try to do it in 3 cuts. And the reason we do that is if you just try to make a single cut on this branch, starting on the top of the branch and cutting through, if it's a heavy branch with any sort of weight, we're very likely to strip bark down the length of the trunk. And I've seen this in the landscape. Trees do not heal well from this. It's a very large wound. And so it's easily preventable. The first cut we make, as depicted there on your screen, is an undercut. That prevents the bark from stripping because the branch bends and falls. So that first cut undercuts. The second cut, we start at the top of the branch and cut all the way through. And with that, we remove the vast majority of that branch. So we don't have to deal with the weight. Then we come back and actually make a third final cut, keeping the branch collar intact and placing it right where it will heal the fastest. And we don't have to try to hold up a branch with one arm and saw with the other and create a mess or fall off the ladder or anything else that might happen. So a three-step process is the way we do good cuts on branches that are more than just a lopper or a hand pruner job. So I was mentioning previously, we talked about not leaving stubs, and I mentioned the word branch collar. When we're looking at trees, and we've got some things today here in person we can look at, where we have branches originating, you'll find basically a stacked bunch of rings or wrinkles. Depending on the tree, they can look a little bit differently. But what those are areas of actively growing cells. We want to leave those intact. So in the left-hand illustration, the red line would be cutting through those actively growing cells and actually damaging them so they don't actually heal well. The green line just outside, leave those intact, and that closes over well. The thing to understand about woody plants, about trees, they do not heal. They compartmentalize damage. They grow around it. And so when we leave a stub on a wound like this, that ring of cells is not able to close around it. So if you go through the landscape or in the woods, you will find dead stubs and you can knock those out or whatever, and there'll just be a hole there because the plant never grew around it completely and compartmentalized it. When we cut it off just outside that collar, that ring closes around it. So if you've ever noticed on trees, circular looking wounds or donut looking wounds, that is a good thing, that those rings roll inward. So it's inward rolling wood. So as they heal, it gets eventually to where it closes off completely. But you'll see round circles on the trunk or on branches. And it kind of looks odd, but it's because that branch collar closed the way it was supposed to. It grew around the damage. So it's important to pay attention to this. And especially the larger the cut we're making, the more important it is we get this right. So do pay attention to this. And again, just to remind you, there is those rare exceptions of we do leave a stub to rejuvenate or to get that regrowth. So when we talk about stone fruits, open center or vase type, we don't have a single strong central leader. We have several scaffold limbs that are spaced as evenly as possible around the trunk and trying to create full coverage. We do allow for ground clearance. So again, depending on how you want to manage underneath these trees, you may want to start your scaffold branches higher or lower. Spreading the limbs with limb spreaders and training those limbs the first couple of years helps us get this good shape. And so again, stone fruits are those things like peaches, nectarines and apricots, even cherries and plum are not as reliable in our area just because of chill hours and how early they bloom in spring. Sour cherries are doable in our area. Sweet cherries are almost not. Occasionally I will come across someone who wants to plant a nectarine or an apricot. And what I always warn them is they're a great blooming tree in spring. We'll see them. They're pretty. They rarely fruit here. They're just not reliable because they bloom so darn early. So if you want a lovely flowering tree, that is an alternative to Bradford pears. I remembered. Took me an hour, but I remembered Bradford pears was the calorie pear I was talking about earlier. They're a great option because they do bloom very prettily, but they rarely fruit here. So just be aware of that. So looking at this structure a little bit more. So At pruning, again, we're pruning things back. We're leaving some stubs. In this example, can't remember which university I borrowed this one from. You'll see they're leaving a little bit longer stubs than what I showed in the previous illustration. There is some variance. I do believe pruning is an art rather than an exact science. So if you have good branches already in places you want, you may leave them a little bit longer. In that first summer of June, you're coming back in, you are thinning out, removing unwanted growth. You are looking at doing some training in May and June to get those branches spread well. There you see the aerial view. So in this particular one, you have 4 scaffold branches. They're kind of arranged equally around that plant. It may be 3, you may have 5. It's not that 4 is a critical number. It's just the principle of they're spaced around that plant. From a side view, you'll notice there is not one single central leader there. You have multiple branches that are all about the same height ultimately, and that's what you're looking for. And then the next year at the dormant pruning, there again, you're doing more thinning, you're removing. You will have branches that try to grow into the center of that open vase. You remove those. You remove branches lower down that may begin to grow. And again, you basically just clean up that structure. And remember, keep in mind you're wanting good air and sunlight penetration throughout. Another example similar, whenever we're beginning, again, with stone fruits, just another representation. The thing to remember is that we do prune these quite heavily year to year because, again, sunlight penetration as well as air movement is important. So 60 to 80% of the last season's growth is probably removed. And so we are wanting to make sure that we are removing enough. We want to leave behind good quality 1-year-old wood that is about the size of a pencil in diameter. And we're pruning those back to about 6 to 8 inches long. So again, we're removing a good bit of material that grows each season, but that allows us to have the best outcome. Central leader trees. So we're talking about our apples and our pears. We still want to have kind of even placement around that tree trunk so we get good coverage on all sides. But now we've got that sort of pyramid shape. We have a point at the top. We have one central leader that is growing at the top. No more an open center. With this one, again, the big thing is we're selecting that central leader early. And each season's pruning, we're maintaining that and we're selecting. We may reselect. There may be a time where it becomes damaged, and so we may have to select another. The other thing to understand with these is we will have more than one set of scaffold branches. So we'll establish the first set, and then maybe 20 inches above, we would establish a secondary set. Because again, these trees are growing more straight up. They're growing upright more than we do with the open vase trees. So we're going to have a series of scaffold branches. It's not just one set. When we're choosing these branches, we do want to think about arrangement. So we typically don't want to have a secondary scaffold branch directly over top of a primary scaffold. In other words, we want them staggered around the tree so that one is never directly over the other. Again, it's all about light and air penetration. And again, we want to make sure that we don't prune off every fruiting spur on the tree. So understand where the fruit is occurring. Watch blooms. In the spring when it blooms, watch where the blooms are happening. That will really help clue you in on what are spurs looking like, because where the flowers are your fruiting spurs. If we have neglected fruit trees, first off, I would encourage you to consider it a several year process. It's not going to be something where we fix it at once. The first things we can do is just start removing dead limbs and branches. Typically in uncared for trees, we're going to have dead material in it. I pulled some out today on one of the apple trees we're going to be pruning on Saturday, and I have some examples back there in the back. We don't necessarily want to come in and remove more than 25 to 30% of the tree at any one given time. So if we're removing very large limbs, again, not perfect. If we have to do that, we have to. we don't want to remove a ton all at once. So to me, it's just a lot of thinning. If you look at pears and apples when they become neglected, what you will find is they are very overgrown on the top and less so on the bottom, because what happens is those upper branches begin shading and literally pushing down on the branches below. If you come Saturday, I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about. And so the general guideline is in the top half of the tree, you probably remove 75% of it. And the bottom half, you maybe remove 50% of it. Now, I know that sounds like government math, but the point is the top is more overgrown than the bottom typically. A lot of times we see a lot of dead material in the bottoms, but because of that, we actually don't remove evenly. We actually take more out of the top than out of the bottom. And sometimes if we're talking about a full-size standard tree, that is physically a challenge. So just be aware of that. But we do, again, if we're not going to get everything in 1 year, it's going to be a several-year process. And truthfully, I think a very poorly neglected tree, it's very hard to get it back to 100% of what it could be. We can vastly improve it. But if you have a very severely neglected tree, sometimes it's a question of would you be better off to buy a new tree and start over? Now, obviously, if it's a variety that you like and things like that, there's reasons to keep it around and maybe propagate it with grafting. But sometimes it can be fighting a losing battle, I think, if it's truly poorly neglected. What I look at if I'm approaching a tree that's not newly planted, that it's established, I go for the 3Ds to begin with, the easy stuff to me. Dead limbs, diseased limbs, look for cankers and any sort of damage. So today I was noticing on some of the trees I was working on, some of the lower limbs were broken off, probably because people on lawnmowers or riders are hitting it. And so they're breaking off the branches. They're not properly removing them. So things like that. You're going to have damage that occurs that has nothing really to do with the tree, but how it's interacting with the people around it. Once you remove those things, that's starting to give you a better look at what's really there in the tree. You start removing water sprouts, but also root suckers. So any limbs that are growing straight up. Very rarely would we want to keep these. There are scenarios if we have multi-leader trees, or if we have, maybe we had to remove a limb because it was damaged and we want to try to get more growth on that side of the tree, we may preserve a water sprout. But as a rule, if it's growing straight up, we're removing it. We want to pay close attention to root suckers, because with root suckers, if we get a disease that attacks that, the disease can move straight into the root and kill the entire tree. So root suckers are very important to keep under control and remove them anytime they're happening. Some root stocks on apple trees, for instance, are more prone to these than others. Some you'll never see it, and some you're cutting some back every single year. So just be aware of that. The other thing we want to remove, and again, especially if we've not been doing a good job with pruning, we'll see a lot of these hangers, limbs growing down, or limbs on the underside of a tree, of limbs and branches that will grow down if we allow them. This is kind of what pushes the limbs below it down, and you kind of get like a cascading or waterfall effect on the tree. So it's important to remove those. And then crowded limbs. You'll have limbs that are growing across one another, over top one of each other. If you just do start thinning these out, and this is what you focus on, pretty soon you'll be getting back to a tree that looks pretty good. And so do approach it incrementally. Again, if it's an established tree, whether it's been unpruned for 1 season or 10, if you kind of follow this step by step, it's going to start you in the right direction. And I promise you, as you prune, the next year you'll come back when you prune it the next year in the dormant season, and you'll ask yourself, why on earth did I leave that limb there? I know I do whenever I prune trees. So sometimes things don't grow the direction you want them to, and all sorts of things happen. The great things about it, the trees still grow, and they still need to be pruned the next year. So even if it doesn't have the exact outcome you want, we've got the ability to remove it. We've got the ability to reshape it to some extent from season to season. So just approach it gradually, and I think it can work well for you. One thing we do want to be paying attention and looking for are disease canker, and a big one that we should pay attention to are fire blight cankers. One of the reasons why we focus a lot of our pruning during the dormant season is fire blight. When fire blight is a bacterial disease, it enters into the plant primarily through nectaries in the flower. And so the way we deal with this is actually cutting out the diseased portions. We want to cut about 8 to 10 inches below the diseased portion if possible. One reason we're cutting that low is because we should avoid the active infection that might be there. This time of year, bacteria shouldn't be very active anyway without sap in the plant. And so this is how we deal with it. This time of year, you're likely not to see the dead leaves attached, but that's very diagnostic during the growing season. When you see that on a plant, you have most likely fire blight, where it has that shepherd's crooking at the end of the twig where it bends over. Very diagnostic for being fire blight. You can see there in the center picture where that canker is infecting a branch or a stem. So it begins typically, again, in the outer portions, more specifically flowers very often, although it can attack other portions of the tree. And so we do want to pay attention to this. I did today when I was out pruning see a few little petioles that were absent their leaves, but still attached and curled and black. The dark color really stands out. There's really not black bark or anything like that on a apple tree, and so it's very it pretty much stands out once you see it and learn to spot it. And we do have some examples in the back for people to look at. If we're talking about stone fruits, one that we can see on our fruit varieties, but I see more typically on ornamental stone fruits like flowering cherries and things, or plums, black knot. And so I often joke in agriculture, the diseases and insects are named so we can't mistake them. That's true of advanced black knot disease. You get these gnarly black growths on the limbs. They will eventually girdle that limb or interrupt the vascular tissues and kill the limb. That tree on the right, you'll eventually have that whole tree dead. And so it's a problem. It's not as common, like I said, in the home orchard, but you could see it in the home orchard. The interesting thing, though, is that early young infections actually don't have a black color. And so I actually have a sample of that in the back if you want to take a look at it. It looks a little bit less dramatic than when it gets more advanced, but this is certainly something that we could see in our home orchards. And certainly there are spray programs that can help, but black knot, the primary method of taking care of it is, again, pruning it out when we see it first in the tree, not letting it progress to what we see on the right. So with that, resources related to this topic, as well as things we didn't cover specifically like spraying and such, are available at this address or through this QR code.